A number of years ago, I was given this really wonderful little book by Kent Nurburn, and it's basically all about the prayer of St. Francis. So it's called Make Me an Instrument of Your Peace. So living in the spirit of the prayer of St. Francis. This part is from his introduction. It says, when we try to understand God, we are like children trying to hold sunlight in our hands. We recognize the presence of something ineffable and mysterious, but it always eludes our grasp. Occasionally, in every tradition, a work emerges that seems to give us a glimpse of that presence. It seems to come from the very heart of God and to contain the mystery and majesty that we so longingly seek. The prayer of St. Francis is such a work. It shines through all the contradictions and illuminates the way of the Spirit like a light from the heart of God. It asks nothing of us that we cannot do, yet it commands the impossible. Would you pray with me? Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me so love. Where there is injury, let me so pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in forgiving that we are forgiven, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
The reading is from Acts 9, verse 10 through 20. There was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. Christ appeared to him in a vision, saying, Ananias! Ananias said, "Here I am." Then Christ said to him, Go at once to Straight Street, and at the house of Judah ask for a certain Saul of Tarsus. He is there praying. Saul had a vision that a man named Ananias would come and lay hands on him so he would recover his sight. But Ananias protested, I have heard from many sources about Saul and all the harm he's done to your holy people in Jerusalem. He is here now with authorization from the chief priest to arrest anybody who calls on your name. Christ said to Ananias, Go anyway. Saul is an instrument I have chosen to bring my name to the Gentiles, to the rulers, to the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he will have to suffer for my name. With that, Ananias left. When he entered the house, he laid his hands on Saul, saying, Saul, my brother, I have been sent by Jesus Christ, who appeared to you on the way here to help you recover your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he regained his sight. He got up and was baptized, and strength returned after he had eaten some food. Saul stayed with the believers in Damascus for a few days, and soon began proclaiming in the synagogues that Jesus was the only begotten of God. Thanks be to God.
When Francis was starting his order, his monastic order, which we now know as the Franciscan order, he wrote something like this, where he said, the rule and order, the rule and life of the friars minor, the little brothers, is simply to live the gospel. in order to be a monastic order, one has to write up their rule. You know, sort of the list of, this is what we're going to live by, the rules that we're going to live by. And so the first rule that he wrote in 1209 and sent off to the Pope was basically a list of quotations from the New Testament. And the Pope wrote him back and said, this isn't a rule or an order, this is just the gospel. And you can kind of hear Francis going, well, yeah, it's just the gospel. That's the only rule and order we need to live by. We like to think of St. Francis as the statue in the garden, don't we? You know, with the cute little bunnies and the squirrels and the bird in his hand, and we think of him as this gentle, tender guy who loves the animals and preaches to the birds, and it's not that he wasn't all of that. But if that's where we stop with Francis, we've diminished who he was and what he taught and what he stood for. Because Francis really taught something hard. He preached something hard. And that was to be like Jesus. To live according to the gospel. What Kent Nurburn said in that little part that I read said that this prayer that he wrote reminds us that we're all an instrument. Just like Jesus said that Saul was going to be an instrument. We're all instruments that God can use to bring wonderful things to the world. And in that prayer, he lays out what we're called to do as instruments. And there is nothing in that prayer that we cannot do. But as Nurburn said, a lot of those things sometimes seem like they're impossible. So I'm going to take the next 4 weeks and pull a couple of lines from that prayer each week, and we're just going to flesh them out and see if perhaps we can find ways to be instruments of peace in our families, in our workplaces, in our world. So the first lines I'm going to pull are, where there is hatred, let me so love, and where there is injury, let me so pardon. And I use the scripture of Ananias because it brings sort of those two together. It brings love and forgiveness together. That story couldn't have been easy for Ananias. I'm hoping you all felt a little compassion for Ananias and the situation he was in. So we start back with Saul, that we all know as the Apostle Paul, right? Changes his name somewhere in there. But Saul is just a nasty guy. I mean, he's persecuting the Christians. Ananias says, you know, he's come to arrest all the Christians. Well, he didn't just arrest them, then they were stoned or they were executed. He was not somebody that if you were a follower of Jesus, you were predisposed to like, right? And yet Jesus decides to change that and to use him as an instrument. And so he, according to the story, does something a little bold and causes Saul to be blind for 3 days. And Saul now, amazingly enough, is obedient and does what Jesus asks, and he goes into the city and waits to be told what to do. In the meantime, Jesus goes to Ananias and says, Ananias got a job for you. You know that Saul guy? I want you to help him because I've got a job for him. And now if you're Ananias, you're thinking, what? You have got to be kidding me, right? I know who this blank guy is, and I don't want to do it. If he's blind now, can't we just like take him out in the middle of the desert, spin him around 3 times and leave him there? Somehow Jesus convinces him that it's going to be okay. That he's going to use Saul, set him on the right path, and he will be an instrument of peace and of light and of love. But boy, he's stretched Ananias's thoughts on that. He's asked him to step out of his comfort zone, to let go of his prejudice, and to let go of his preconceived notions of Saul, to let go of the conflict. In other words, to act in a spirit of forgiveness and love toward this guy who has done nothing but be hateful and vengeful toward the followers of Jesus. And I'm not convinced that Ananias goes with a full heart. At least if I were Ananias, I'd be like, fine, I'll go, but I don't have to like it, right? Say you're sorry like you mean it, Mike. Yeah, no, but I'll say I'm sorry. And so he goes and he helps Saul. But in all of that, we find that you can't just, if Ananias and Jesus are preaching love, it doesn't just end with people that you don't like or people who are against you. It has to include all of it. Love includes a reaching out in forgiveness and in pardoning and in apologizing and all of those pieces. And that's hard stuff. I mean, if somebody hurts you, how do you feel? If someone wrongs you, how do you feel? This is where you talk back to me. Betrayed. Less than. How do you feel if you've been wronged?
Angry.
Angry? Hurt? Taken advantage of? Vulnerable. Yeah, all of those things. So if somebody's wronged you, how do you react? A lot of us withdraw.
Retaliate.
Or retaliate. I think those are the two. I don't get mad, I get even. Or I don't want anything to do with them anymore. That's it, I'm done. Francis is asking something really hard here. As does Jesus. They say that if you are going to walk the path of love, if you are going to be an instrument of the Spirit, then you don't get to turn your back on those people who have wronged you or those people who hate you. And that's really tough. So let's flesh out the first one a bit. Where there is hatred, let me so love. Hatred is a really strong emotion. I mean, it's not like saying, I hate anchovies on my pizza. Which I've never really tried, but frankly, that kind of grosses me out. But hatred is at its core, is an emotion that is filled with bitterness and anger and probably fear. It's something when we come across raw anger, raw hatred, what do? I mean, you kind of want to run, don't you? And yet, we're asked to get up closer to it, to try and overcome hatred with love. You know, hatred comes out of an emptiness and a deep, deep pain that comes out of a person in something that's violent and ugly. Hatred comes out of a loneliness. And it can't ever fill that soul by lashing out. You know what I'm saying? Love comes from a full soul. It comes from a place of wholeness and healing. And so it's love that's given, even in the face of hatred, that can fill the emptiness inside someone else. Nuremberg kind of points out that someone who's acting in hatred is really crying out for love. And how do we do that? Brene Brown, in the book that we're reading for the women's group, called Braving the Wilderness, says that it's really hard to hate people up close. It's really hard to hate people up close. And so she encourages you, even though you want to turn and run away from these people who are spewing hatred, it's more important to get up close and get to know them, and know their story, and try to understand them. So that you're not returning hatred for hatred. That you don't become a mirror of that hatred and start to just spew it back, but that you start to perhaps plant the seeds of love in the face of that. I mean, in this world right now where we are demonizing and vilifying people who look different and think different and have different politics and different religions and different skin colors and different sexual orientations, we are much more apt to put people at arm's length and lump them into a group and say, well, those people think this way and are this way and they're awful as a group. And yet I bet you that everyone in this room has a friend who thinks differently than them, has a different skin color, has a different religion, and they're a friend. They're like somebody you like. You enjoy being with them, and you know that even though you don't agree on whatever, how to worship or who to vote for, you know that they're kind, and they're generous, and they're good to their dog, and they love Mexican food, and they're fun to be with. And so you put whatever that difference is aside because you could see the good person underneath, right? You've all got someone like that in your life. You just don't touch the difference because it really isn't important at the end of the day. That in and of itself should teach all of us that the closer you get to someone that we might consider an enemy, someone who might hate part of us and what we think or how we are or who we are, we can still see a person underneath that. We can still have a friendship underneath that. That the closer we've gotten, the more love we can sow. And the less hatred there is to go around. And it's not always possible to get right up close and personal with somebody who's filled with hatred, but you know what? We can plant seeds of love in places where hatred has been prevalent. There was a video that went viral in June, and maybe you saw it. It was a dad giving out free dad hugs at the Pride Parade in Pittsburgh. The backstory is that Scott Dittman saw that there were a bunch of mothers who were going to wear free mom hugs to the Pride Parade. And he thought, you know, that's really cool. He said, I bet dads have been even tougher on their LGBT kids than moms. And so he ordered himself a shirt that said, free dad hugs. And he wore it to the Pride Parade, and he thought, you know, this is just going to be a great day of hugs and fun and smiles. And yet he found that there was a whole lot of hurt and sadness that he encountered. The video that went viral was from a young woman who came from the other side of the parade, went through the parade, latched onto him, and just hugged him and said, thank you, thank you, thank you, over and over and over again. He said he wasn't going to be the one to break contact. And he had another young man who came up and hugged him and just sobbed in his arms. He was 19 when his parents kicked him out of the house, and he hadn't talked to him since. After, I gotta read you what he posted on Facebook. What Scott posted after all of this. To encourage parents to love and accept their children. He said, imagine that your child feels so lost from you that they sink into the arms of a complete stranger and sob endlessly just because that stranger is wearing a shirt offering hugs from a dad. Think of the depths of their pain. Trying to imagine how deep those cuts must be. Please don't be the parent of a child that has to shoulder that burden. I met way too many of them of all ages today. Planting just a seed of love where there has been hatred can make such a difference. Where there is injury, let us sow pardon. And when we talk about being wronged, being hurt, being in pain, it's an injury. It's an interesting way for him to put that, where there's been injury, pardon, where we've been physically hurt, where there needs to be healing. And Francis is talking about reconciliation and healing, not agreement necessarily, or even acceptance, but just a way to reconcile. So one more story. There's a story, long time ago. This is how you know it's a story. Long time ago. There were two farmers, brothers actually, who owned adjacent farms. And they farmed the land together, and they were great to each other, good friends, good brothers, until one day they had a minor disagreement. And that minor disagreement grew into a major argument, which grew into an explosion where words were said that should not have been said. And then there was silence, and they hadn't spoken to each other since. 40 years of farming and collaborating together and being good neighbors down the tubes in a few minutes. Well, one day, a man came to the older brother's house. Came to John's house carrying a box of carpenter tools. Said, hey, I'm looking for some work. Got anything, got any small jobs I can do for a little bit of money around here? And John said, I've got just the thing for you. He said, you see that farm over there? In fact, that's my brother's farm. Because there used to be a meadow between us. But then he took his bulldozer and he knocked down the river levee, and now there's a stream between us. So he thinks he's got me. But you know what? I've got one better on him. There's a pile of lumber over there by the barn. I want you to build an 8-foot-high fence so I don't ever have to see him or his farm ever again. And the carpenter said, I think I see what you need. That you just show me where the nails are, where the post hole digger is, and I'll get to work. And well, John had to go into town for some stuff that day, so he helped him get everything ready, and then he took off, and the carpenter worked all day, and he hammered, and he nailed, and he measured, and he created a beautiful bridge across the stream, all with handrails and everything. Well, John came back about sundown to see that there was not a fence, but a bridge. And he was so astonished he could hardly say anything, and there was his brother coming on the other side with his hand outstretched saying, I can't believe you did this. After everything I said and did to you, I can't believe you would build a bridge. And they stood on either end of the bridge and looked at each other, and then they met in the middle, and they took each other's hands. And then they turned to see the carpenter who was packing up his tools and starting to head off, and John said, wait, I've got some more things you can do here, if you can stay a few days. And the carpenter said, I'd love to, but I have more bridges to build. We're asked to sow the seeds of love and forgiveness. Not expect to be planting full-grown trees, just to plant the seeds. Something that God can work with and help grow. And maybe you plant a hug, or maybe you build a bridge, or maybe you share a few nice words. Maybe you share a song, or hold a door, offer words of apology. Sit down and get to know someone because you want to understand them, not because you want to argue with them. Plant the seeds. That's all we're asking.